The One Piece manga has been on fire recently, and as of chapter 1166 releasing, the God Valley incident is officially over. Because this battle was one of the most legendary confrontations in all of One Piece with some of the greatest fights and greatest lore drops we've seen in the entire story, many people forget that this section of the manga is actually a flashback in a flashback. We will now be returning to the Harold backstory as a way to reconnect with the Elbaf arc in the present day of the manga. However, Harold's backstory is not the only thing that the hype legendary battles of God Valley have distracted One Piece readers from. In this backstory, I think it's very possible that Oda has subtly mentioned the key to the end of One Piece 3 times, sneaking a name right under our noses. The Galera or Galela giants, frozen in ice somewhere, this band of ancient giant shipwrights. This has by far been the most under-talked about aspect of the last 10 chapters of flashbacks, understandably so considering we got God Valley after all this time. However, these 3 subtle mentions of the Galera giants are extremely important for the end of One Piece, so important that some might call it the key to the end of the story, and by the end of this video, you'll understand just how important they are and how they might be used to take down the world government. If you enjoy stuff like this, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you on the channel, and let's talk about this hidden aspect of the flashback. So because mentions of the Galera giants has been kinda overshadowed by God Valley, let's go over the 3 instances where these giants are mentioned in the manga and dissect every bit of information we can about this mystery. The Galera giants are first introduced in chapter 1154 with this conversation between Harold and Jarl. We first find out that they are known as the Galera Warhammer Company, and they were a band of ancient giant shipwrights that armed themselves with warhammers. It is worth mentioning that the kanji for Galera Warhammer Company literally directly translates to Great Hammer Battalion, which is extremely important for later in this video, so just keep that in the back of your mind for now. Essentially, we learned that they traveled far and wide, and they sent letters back to Elbaf of their journeys, and the final letter said that they'd all been captured. Over 100 warriors were taken prisoner, including ancient giants. Essentially, in this chapter, this conversation is all about, because Harold was at the reverie, he might have been captured and tortured because he was a giant. The reason being, giants had a terrible reputation with the world government previously because of the Galera giants from the past, who are heavily alluded to be part of the ancient kingdom, or at least some kind of ancient enemy to the world government. I think it is safe to say this because Jarl says there is no doubt that they faced a great enemy, however, they sank deep into the ocean at a certain point in history. To me, this quite obviously means that they were part of the ancient kingdom who fought against Emu and the coalition of other nations in the Void Century, and because they were enemies to the world government, the race that is the giants were permanently discriminated against for pretty much the rest of history, and that is the stigma that Harold is trying to fight against in his flashback, which is why this conversation is important to the context of the character. Now, after this first mention of the Galera giants, you might just think that this was adding important context as to why the giants were discriminated against and why Harold has to work so hard in order to regain the favor of the world government. And that would make sense. However, the second mention of these giants in this flashback is Rox talking about what he needs to take down the world government, and this is where things get very interesting. Rox says he's after 2 devil fruits. One of them is most likely on Elbaf, and it'll only show its true power if Harold eats it. Now, before we move on to the rest of this scene and this dialogue, I need to make clear that this devil fruit that Rox is talking about here, the one that's most likely on Elbaf that will only show its true power if Harold eats it, is 100% the legendary fruit of Elbaf that was passed down to Loki, who ate it on the day that his father died. I don't think there is any other context in the story that points towards this devil fruit being something else. As far as we know, Harold does not have a devil fruit himself, so if Rox is saying there's a devil fruit on Elbaf that he wants that will only show its true power if Harold eats it, it is obviously going to be the fruit that is passed down through Elbaf lineage, the fruit that Loki currently possesses. So let's move on, just remember that important piece of context. After Rox says that, Captain John and Big Mom talk about that they're going to need those Galera folks too, and that Big Mom is trying to track them down, but there's nothing about a frozen army of giants. Now, this whole frozen army thing was also mentioned in that first conversation between Harold and Jarl, where Jarl talks about a frozen army of giants somewhere in the world. Big Mom, again, is talking about it here. This just confirms that the Galera giants that everyone is looking for in this scene are somewhere out there frozen in ice. If the first mention of the Galera giants was just seemingly adding context to why the world government hates the giants, This scene right here shows us a lot more of their importance. Not only is Oda confirming for us that they are somewhere out there in the world, he is also telling us that they play an instrumental role in taking down the world government, or at least this vision or this plan that Rox has requires their assistance. And finally, the third mention of the Galera Giants happens in this chapter, 1166. Loki is remembering all of his conversations with Rox after the news that Rox has passed down God Valley, and Rox drops some serious lore here with the Galera Giants. Listen up, Loki. Somewhere out there, the Galera are slumbering. They're an outrageous band of Ravagers, and the only one who can put them back into play is your pops. There are two insanely important things to pick up on in this panel. The first is that the only one who can put them back into play is your pops, obviously referring to Harold. Obviously, you could interpret this as Harold is the strongest giant and the king of Elbaf, so he would be able to command the Galera Giants, and that could be what Oda was getting at here. However, I think there's something deeper that Oda is hinting at here. Let's go back to that second mention of the Galera Giants. When Rox says, as I was saying, there's two devil fruits I'm after, one of them's most likely on Elbaf, and it'll only show its true power if Harold eats it, the very next thing that's said is Captain John talking about the Galera Giants. When chapter 1156 dropped, I thought these two things were exclusive. Rox not only wanted the devil fruit power that Harold possesses, he also wanted the Galera Giants. However, after chapter 1166, this conversation between Rox and Loki, I feel like these two things are together. They are a mutual want that Rox had before he passed. Meaning that the ancient devil fruit of Elbaf, the one that Rox wanted Harold to eat and the one that Loki now has, the one that will only show its true power in the hands of a giant, is likely a devil fruit that will possibly awaken the Galera Giants or give the power to command them. These two panels together really make me feel like there is no other thing Rox could be alluding to here. If there's a devil fruit that he wanted Harold to eat, and he wanted Harold to join his team, and Harold was the only one who can bring these giants back into play in the world, the common outcome of all of these things is that obviously the devil fruit means you have the power to awaken these insane ancient Ravagers. But the second thing that's extremely important in this panel that I want you to pay attention to for the end of this video is that Rox is talking to Loki here. Oda is showing us that Loki here now has the information that the only one who can bring back the Galera Giants is his father. I know that probably doesn't seem like important right now, but it will be important for the rest of this video, so just hang on to that information that Oda is specifically giving Loki this information in this chapter. So, those are the three mentions of the Galera Giants in One Piece so far. I'm now going to put a visual up of all the things that we have extrapolated from these panels to give us a kind of list as to why they should be important or what we should be looking for in the future of the story as we try to theorize for the rest of this video what their role will be as One Piece continues. So from chapter 1154, we learn that these giants are an ancient band of warrior shipwrights who fought against the world government in the Void Century and eventually lost and are out there frozen somewhere. We also learn that their actions is the reason why the world government hates Elbaf and what Harold has to work to undo. In 1156, we learn that Rox has a plan to take on the world government. He needs two devil fruits to enact this plan. One of them is the legendary fruit on Elbaf, a fruit that will only show its true power if Harold or a giant eats it, and that for this plan, he needs the Galera Giants as well. And lastly, in chapter 1166, the chapter that just released, we learn that the only one who can wake up the Galera Giants is Harold, which leads me to the conclusion that the legendary devil fruit of Elbaf, if it is in the hands of a giant, has the power to either wake up, find, or command the Galera Giants. From all of this information, we can extrapolate two important questions that will answer everything. The first question is, why are the ancient giants required to take down the world government? And two, what is the power of the legendary devil fruit, and why is it required to access these giants? Now stay with me as I'm going to try and answer both of these questions. These are theories, so they're a little bit loose. However, I think I've come up with a really good idea as to why these giants are extremely important and are the key to the end of One Piece. First, let's talk about why Rox wanted these giants and why they are seemingly such a pivotal point in taking down the world government. Now, of course, you could just chalk up the answer to this question as, well, they're a band of ancient giants. Surely their manpower alone is enough to rival an entire nation, and that is extremely valuable in taking down the world government. That's the end of the story. And while I would agree with you, because the world government themselves in the present day of One Piece is trying to kidnap giants to become their own warriors, I think there's a specific inclusion in the Galera depiction that gives me a different answer to this question. The inclusion that they are shipwrights. Could Oda including this information just have been a way to show how Galera in Water 7 got its name? Absolutely. However, let's look one step deeper here. If these giants are ancient shipwrights and they were active in the time of the Void Century and the Ancient War, is there not a massive chance that these were the people who created the Pluton, this massive battleship that was capable of destroying islands? We know the Pluton was active in the Void Century as it is an ancient weapon that came from that time period, and we also know that it is capable of blowing up islands. I think if you ask me, a ship that is capable of that amount of damage must be gigantic and indestructible. What two qualities would achieve gigantic and indestructible? Well, probably if it was crafted by a group of ancient giants who had access to Elbaf's treasure tree Atom, wood that is insanely durable and known to create the most legendary ships in all of One Piece. Not only that, there's a bit of a connection here with Frankie, who has the blueprints of the Pluton memorized and is currently on Elbaf with the treasure tree Atom, the wood that he crafted the Thousand Sunny out of. Not to mention, these blueprints were passed down from Tom, the founder of the Galera shipbuilding company on Water 7, which is very obviously named after this band of giant shipwrights. There is this very clear connection that I think Oda is making here, that the ancient giants, the Galera company, was responsible for building Pluton. This is probably why Rox wants the giants. He obviously is very knowledgeable about Emu, and if he was clued into Emu's possession of ancient weapon Uranus, he would need the power to rival an ancient weapon, which of course is only possible by the use of another ancient weapon, Pluton. So that leads me to the answer of our first question. The reason why Rox wants these ancient giants and why they are pivotal to destroying the world government is because they are the original creators of Pluton, and Rox needs an ancient weapon to rival the ancient weapon that the world government is in possession of. But we still have one more question here. Why is the ancient devil fruit of Elbaf required to either find these giants or awaken them or command them or something along those lines? Let's talk about that now. It is extremely hard to hypothesize why the ancient devil fruit, specifically in the hands of a giant, would be required to either awaken or command or locate the ancient band of Galera giants. It could really be anything, especially when we don't know what the devil fruit is. Knowing what the devil fruit is would probably answer this question very easily. However, it's a stretch, but I feel like I might have an idea as to why this devil fruit is required, specifically in the hands of a giant, so hear me out. It is no secret that Loki currently possesses the devil fruit that Rox is talking about here. I know we haven't seen Loki's devil fruit yet, but what if I told you we actually might have already seen it? Again, this is a stretch, but hear me out. In One Piece, we have never, ever seen a weapon the caliber of Loki's Ragnir. We've seen weapons imbued with haki like Yoru from Mihawk. We've seen incredibly unique weapons like the baseball launcher dog from Alabasta. But we have never seen a weapon capable of summoning thunder on the scale of lighting Elbaf's tree on fire. And I'm not just glazing Loki's weapon for nothing here. What I'm getting at is I think the weapon itself might be the ancient devil fruit passed down in Elbaf lineage. Now your first reaction to that claim might be, but Loki has a hammer before he eats a devil fruit. We see him have one on his back as he's walking into the throne room the day his father was killed. To that, I would say it's a good point. However, I think this hammer is deliberately covered up to hide the fact that it looks different than Ragnir, the one Loki is using now, because that would spoil that the legendary devil fruit is in fact the hammer. Now again, this is extremely speculative, so stay with me here, but one of the things I told you to remember in the very beginning of this video was that the Galera Giant's kanji directly translates to Great Hammer Battalion. If the legendary devil fruit is required in the hands of a giant to command or locate the Galera giants, wouldn't it make sense for that devil fruit to be a hammer with an insane amount of power, the one that Loki wields now? As for how this would specifically help finding the giants, I haven't been able to come up with a concrete answer. The only thing that I can think of is that perhaps the person who wields the strongest hammer, or the person who wields Ragnir specifically, is given the right to command these giants, almost like someone with the founding Titan has the ability to command the rumbling in Attack on Titan. Perhaps it is the same deal here, and the reason why it can only be in the hands of a giant to show its true power, like Rox mentioned, is because if someone who wasn't a giant wielded it, it would no longer be the most powerful hammer amongst the Galera giants, hence you would lose the ability to command these forces. Additionally, it's quite obvious that this hammer extremely resembles Thor's hammer from the Marvel Universe, which we all know can only be wielded by worthy users. It could be the same inspiration here, where only giants can wield Ragnir. As for the logistics of how the hammer is the devil fruit specifically that gets passed on in Elbaf lineage, I think we already have this explanation. We have seen weapons eat devil fruits before. I think it's entirely possible that this hammer has eaten a devil fruit, perhaps the devil fruit of a god with the power to command thunder, like we saw Loki do previously, and this hammer is passed down through Elbaf lineage. It would also make sense because if a devil fruit specifically was passed down through Elbaf lineage, it doesn't exactly make any sense. There's really no purpose of a devil fruit that's not being eaten, and it wouldn't really make sense to have a devil fruit sit in the palace of Elbaf and have no one consume it for the entire nation's history. If the hammer had eaten a devil fruit and became this sacred object in Elbaf's history, it would make a lot more sense for why it is not being used, and also how it was stolen so easily, because it's a weapon, not an actual devil fruit. So now we have two insanely speculative, albeit, answers to the two questions we had just asked. The Galera giants are specifically required for taking down the world government because they have the power to build Pluton, and the reason why the legendary devil fruit in the hands of a giant is required to use them is because the devil fruit is actually Ragnir, and if a giant possesses this hammer, they become the king or the commander of the Galera giants. Now, I know that sounds crazy. However, when you look at the current story of One Piece and the predicament that these Straw Hats are in, you can almost tie together the pieces that are loose ends here, and it all starts to make sense. The other thing that I told you to keep in the back of your mind is that Oda specifically is giving Loki this information about the Galera giants in this chapter, which means Loki knows of their existence and now probably knows that the only person capable of finding them and commanding them is him, because he is the giant wielding Ragnir, the legendary devil fruit of Elbaf. This also adds a ton of credit to his claim that he said in his introduction about bringing about the end of the world. If he knows about the Galera giants and his power to command them, this is something that he's actually capable of doing. Not only that, the only person capable of building Pluton in the entire world right now is on Elbaf, where the treasure tree is located, fighting against the world government, the people that Rox wanted to use the Galera giants to defeat in the first place. I have not seen so many puzzle pieces connect like this in a theory that I've created maybe ever. I think it is entirely possible that in the fight against the world government, Luffy and his allies suffer a potential defeat or at least a close call on Elbaf. Loki uses the knowledge he gained from Rox to realize that the Straw Hats and the nation of Elbaf need the Galera giants in their future fight against the world governments in the final war, so Loki uses his hammer to command these giants to use the treasure tree atom and the Pluton blueprints that Frankie has in his mind to upgrade the Thousand Sunny into a boat capable of rivaling Emu and the world government. Not only that, this would mean the Straw Hats ship is big enough to carry Loki, who is the #1 candidate for the next Straw Hat, who, if this doesn't happen, would not be able to sail on the Thousand Sunny because he is way too big. This theory is pretty insane, I know, but there's one glaring issue that you're probably thinking right now. All of that makes sense, but how the hell is Loki and the Straw Hats going to find the Galera giants? Aren't they frozen somewhere in the world? Even if Loki's able to command them using Ragnir, we don't know where they are. Unless we've already found them. In chapter 660 of One Piece in Punk Hazard, which I might remind you is a place where Caesar Clown and Vegapunk were studying gigantification, the Straw Hats run into a frozen army of giants, ones that explicitly resemble the ones Jarl is mentioning in chapter 1154. These two panels look very similar. Not only that, they're in jailed uniforms, which would make sense because, as we know thanks to their letter, the Galera Giants were captured by the world government as part of their crimes in the ancient war, so of course it makes sense for them to be in prison uniforms captured on a world government facility. And if you want to get really crazy, one of the giants in this Punk Hazard panel has a tattoo that very much resembles the Galera Company's logo from Water 7, a shipwright business that very clearly takes inspiration from these ancient giant shipwrights. We already know where the Galera Giants are frozen, meaning Loki has the power to command them, because the people who know where they are, the Straw Hats, are the exact people he'd be helping with this operation. And that concludes this wild roller coaster of a theory. I know there's still some loopholes here and there, like would the Straw Hats go back to Punk Hazard before the final war? I think it's possible that, I don't know, maybe they go and find the One Piece or the last poneglyph while Loki goes to get the giants or something like that, but that's just to say there is still some problems with this theory. However, I think it's a super interesting idea with way too many connecting pieces to just be a nothing burger. Maybe I'm not correct personally, but I think there's some pieces in this puzzle that are connecting. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. I really appreciate it. If you enjoy stuff like this, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below if you like this theory, if there's something I missed, if you have any different ideas. I'll try and read everything you guys have to say. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.